Oh. You know, it's funny because I was telling Jacqueline, I couldn't get the QR code to work for me. I think it's because I was trying to do it in the participants window. If you do it from gallery, it works. That's what
Yes, that's what I thought you did. I was going to say that.
That's what you need to say. Tell people to do it from the gallery view. I was trying to do it from this little teeny tiny little thing and it just would not work. I'm like, I don't know how they can get that thing to work. But I just now shifted to gallery and I went, oh, I see. So just, for dummies like me, when you're giving the announcement, make sure you tell people they can donate best from gallery view. Yeah, thank you. I was watching in speaker this morning and didn't see that. All right. Hello, everyone. Good to see you. So as Sina mentioned, I only have 30 minutes tonight. So my goal for tonight is to finish teaching the 4 principles of God. If I finish in 30 minutes, then I'll go to the questions. If not, I promise we'll go to the questions next week. But as I answer the questions, I want to answer the questions in the context of the 4 principles of God. And I can't do that until I've finished teaching them. Does that sound okay with everybody? All right, then I'm going to share my screen. So this is the 4 principles of God. We spent 2 weeks on the 4th principle of God. The 4th principle of God, as you now know, is manifestation. It's often called the dream or the illusion. It includes the person, all persons. It includes the world. It includes the universe, including that new galaxy they discovered 2 days ago. Did you hear about that? Yeah, a brand new galaxy that's like humongous, way, way bigger than our galaxy. It includes thought, both we discussed it includes both right-minded thought and wrong-minded thought. It includes all emotions, all images, including mental images, any afterlife experiences, including reincarnation, any paranormal experiences such as ghosts or aliens or demons or anything like that, right? All of that is the 4th principle of God. And then what we talked about a couple weeks ago was the 3rd principle of God. And the 3rd principle of God is called the creative process. It's also often called mind. It's also often called God. People think of God as the creator, right? So it's often actually called God, this 3rd principle is. But the 3rd principle is the process through which everything in the 4th principle comes into being, right? It's the creative principle. It's the process through which everything in the 4th principle comes into being. And as we talked about, again, most of you may still perceive yourself as a person, but that's only an appearance in the 4th principle. That's not what you are. You are actually with a little a, consciousness. And a part of consciousness is what we call attention. That's actually another word for mind. And what you place attention on, especially believing attention on, that's the power of the 3rd principle. That's what brings things into manifestation. And again, this is what's really important, at least to me. I should speak for myself. You may not care at all. But this is what's really important about having the experience of being a person in a world, is when we have the experience of being a person in a world, if we believe that and we believe everything that's happening in our experience, then we're constantly placing believing attention on all kinds of things, such as fear, unworthiness, guilt, blame, judgment, attack, jealousy, envy, and I'm sure the list goes on, but I always run out of ideas at some point. But we're placing our attention on these things. And as we place our attention on these things, thinking that we're people when we're not people, we're creating this. And again, this became very, very important for me when I realized this. This is when I went into hyper mode with mind watching. Mind watching being, where am I placing my attention? One thing that's really interesting is you don't actually have any control at all over the thoughts that come into your mind. There's not a damn thing you can do about that. Whereas consciousness, where your control is, or where your choice is where you place your attention. So like if a thought comes into the mind of the person, that's just a manifestation, by the way. Thought is another manifestation, another illusion, another part of the fourth principle. So if a thought comes into the mind of the person, that's really nothing, no matter what the thought is. But then when you give it attention as consciousness, you kind of enliven the energy of that thought. And, it kind of comes up, gets enlivened, and comes back down and manifests in some way, right? So this is where I got hyper involved in mind watching, or paying attention to where I was placing my attention, because I did not want to participate in bringing more fear in the world, more blame in the world, more guilt in the world, more unworthiness in the world, more perception of unfairness in the world, more lack in the world. I didn't want to do that. And so as a result, when those thoughts showed up in this person's mind, I did not place my attention, which is the third principle of God, on those thoughts. I chose to just let them go, right? And then that way I become more neutral, at least. And if I start placing a lot of attention with right-minded thoughts, I can even become more positive as an influence in the fourth principle of God. Again, everything is about where I place my attention. And this is true for all of us. And this is, again, where this is very hard to accept. In fact, Lao Tzu basically in sharing the same process through the Tao Te Ching said something like, the fool hears about the Tao and laughs out loud, right? Because the fool thinks, I need to get out there and I need to protest this wrong in the world. I need to somehow fight against this wrong in the world. And what Lao Tzu and what the third principle of God are teaching is, when you give your attention to that, you're actually manifesting more of that. The best thing to do is just simply not give it your attention. But the fool laughs out loud at that. The fool says, problems are never going to be solved if I don't give them my attention, right? So this is very difficult sometimes for people to accept that this is a divine law, right? This is, it's kind of funny, as we go up in the four principles of God, we get, you could say, more and more real, right? More and more real. So the third principle of God is more of a reality than the fourth principle of God. Where you place your attention is more important than your experience in the world. Now I'm going to move up to the second principle of God. And I haven't really taught the second principle of God and the first principle of God yet, but I'm going to keep these very, very simple. The second principle of God is subject awareness, or it's often called the I am principle. It's this sense of existence, would be another way to word it. A sense that something is here that exists. It's often called the Son of God, because it's the only thing that is born directly out of the first principle. It's often called Christ or Christ consciousness, sometimes even Buddha consciousness. It's called unity consciousness. Lots of people, when they have, because remember, each of these is more real than the previous one. So if you've woken up from the fourth principle, which is the least real of all, into the second principle, which is much more real, many people at this level think they have awakened all of the way, but they haven't. What they have awakened to is pure subject awareness. And they also perceive everything as essence awareness. So they perceive everything in the same way. Even though, of course, their eyes still know the difference between a glass and a telephone, for example, and they can effectively use a glass to drink water and effectively use a telephone to communicate. There's this way of seeing that knows that everything is consciousness. Everything is that essence. And when they're awake to the second principle of God, this is not mental. This is an actual experience. So they see everything as pure consciousness. And some of the things that disappear when you awaken to the second principle of God is things like judgment. Because you see everything in the world as just the unfolding of the creative process. You understand that the creative process just works the way it is. You are now awake beyond the creative process. You're not affected by the creative process. You're just able to see, this is what A Course in Miracles might call above the battleground. You're just able to see everything in such a different way that you're truly able to allow everything to be as it is. You're truly able to always be the presence of love, to be happy, to be content. You can still participate, but you participate from a much different perspective. So you now see yourself and everything as pure consciousness. All appearance is merely, and you really have to highlight the word merely, temporary manifestation of the creative process. In fact, there's a big experience of being the here now. I don't want to say being here now, but being the here now, right? Like that is what you are. And everything, all these appearances are passing through you. You're the consciousness that all of the appearances are occurring in. You know, one way that's kind of fun to think about sometimes, if you think of like a crystal ball is like the consciousness. And then all of the images inside of the crystal ball are the fourth principle of God. But you are now the crystal ball. So since you are pure consciousness, even though you're still fully aware of everything at this level, you are not affected by anything at this level because you see it for what it is. Temporary appearance, coming and going. And again, even if the person dies, you understand that you're the consciousness that was here before the person was born, after the person is gone, and even the person's death does not affect you. So it's a completely different way of seeing. But it's still not the first principle of God. And the first principle of God, I can't talk about. Anything that I would say would just be making stuff up. But the reason I know about the first, second, third, and fourth principle of God is because first in contemplation in 2012, and then at different times since then, somehow my knowing went up here and then came right back. The first time it came up here and went right back, the only way I can describe that is that I saw that consciousness was an object, and this, the first principle of God, was not. That's the best way to describe it. The first principle of God is not an object. Now, the second principle of God does not seem like an object compared to the fourth principle of God. It's kind of funny. Compared to the fourth principle of God, the second principle of God seems formless by comparison. But in reality, just the sense of something that exists, the sense of awareness that exists, is actually a very, very subtle type of object. And the first principle of God is prior to even that type of manifestation, even that subtle manifestation. In fact, you'll notice I called it pure, unmanifest life intelligence, or one of my favorite words for it is isness, or just the word is. It is often referred to with terms such as source, Father, heaven, nirvana, absolute. Of course, the Tao could be here as well. Something in form that you might liken it to, although this is just a symbol, and the symbol, all symbols are limited. But one thing you might liken the first principle of God to is like a seed, right? A seed has no consciousness. A seed has no plan. A seed is not concerned about whether it exists or does not exist, right? A seed simply is. But if that seed is planted, whether by nature or by man, and gets all of the right amount of light and water and whatever it needs, that seed grows perfectly without any consciousness, without any plan, without any concerns. And that's kind of how consciousness comes out of the first principle of God, right? And then, of course, the third principle, the creative process, comes out of consciousness, and the world comes out of that. But the seed is the first principle of God. It's the source. It's the isness. It's where everything begins. But there is nothing here that thinks, that plans, that says I am. In fact, I read a great sentence. I love this sentence. I think it was in one of Bernadette Roberts' books, but I read a great sentence in the last week when somebody else was talking about this. I think it was Bernadette. And she said that if someone makes the mistake of saying, I am God, that mistake occurs at the level of the second principle of God. She says, when you awaken to this level, which she calls heaven, when you awaken to this level, there's no I to say, I am God. Right? So it's beyond any sense of, think of a seed. Would a seed say, I exist? Or would a seed say, I don't exist? It wouldn't say either, right? It just is. Would a seed say, I intend to grow into a tomato plant? Or, nope, I'm going to grow into a tree? The seed has no intention, right? Is the seed concerned about whether it becomes planted or not? Nothing, right? The first principle of God is like that. But what happens is that some, we'll call them people, because I don't know what else we would call them. Some people awaken all the way through the third principle of God, the second principle of God, and to the first principle of God. And those people who have awakened that far attempt to tell us the difference between only awakening to the second principle of God and awakening all the way to the first. And they seem to say that when you awaken to the second principle of God, you are only midway in your journey. Don't make the mistake of thinking you are finished. Kind of reminds me of something Nisargadatta said. Nisargadatta said that many spiritual devotees confuse the dawn for the noon, right? It's just beginning and they think they're halfway there, or something like that, right? So I don't know why I became aware of this, but I did become aware of this. And then once I became aware of this, I began to notice this teaching in places where I hadn't seen it before. It's clear in A Course in Miracles. In A Course in Miracles, awakening to the second principle of God is called true perception, or the world. Awakening to the first principle of God is called knowledge, or heaven, and it's described as beyond perception entirely. Of course, Bernadette Roberts does a great job. This is her mission, is to talk about the difference between awakening to unity consciousness and awakening to heaven, using her Catholic terms. But those are the four principles. And so one thing I want to talk about briefly is my little guy here. Let me stop my share. My little guy here. But I'm going to view myself just so I can see this a little better when I'm showing you. There we go. So as I mentioned, this person represents the fourth principle of God. This represents attention. This represents the second principle of God, or pure consciousness. And notice I don't have anything here that represents the first principle of God. But the spiritual path, if you guys look at this, notice how I have the silly putty, the attention, going all the way around the person. Typically, when we start the spiritual path, we are completely attached to who we think we are. Completely attached. See that? That's attention. That's attention, guys. That's what's attached. If you wonder what's attached, it's attention. How much attention do we give to me? I mean, pay attention to your thoughts. They're all about me, right? That's what they're about. Even when they're about somebody else, they're about that somebody else in relation to me, right? So in the beginning of the spiritual path, attention is completely attached to the person. So what the spiritual path is the spiritual path is, in one way or another, and there are different practices, becoming detached from the person. Now, that doesn't mean the person doesn't exist, but it's not clung to by attention anymore. And then starting to turn that attention around and move the attention back towards the consciousness. Start focusing more and more and more into the consciousness until the attention becomes reabsorbed into the consciousness. And in effect, begins to identify again. Nisargadatta was very clear that when you awaken to the second principle, there's still an identification, but you now identify with consciousness. There's a lot of people will call this the true self. That's what the spiritual path is about. The spiritual path isn't as much about awakening to the first principle of God. That seems to happen on its own. That seems to carry its own energy. We often hear it worded that God takes the last step. So the focus of the spiritual path primarily is about awakening to consciousness. And then once you've awakened to consciousness, then some automation can kind of kick in that's going to start taking you to the next level. But again, when you wonder what's waking up, Who's waking up? If the person is an illusion, who or what is waking up? It's attention. Attention starts off thinking, this is me. The intention starts realizing, oh, wait a minute, maybe this is me. And then attention pays more and more attention until it's absorbed back in, and attention realizes, I'm consciousness, I'm pure consciousness. That's what I've always been. So let me just stop there. I do have questions written down on paper, but we only have 5 minutes. So let me just see what questions there might be here in the sanctuary about everything I've just shared. Because next week, I'll just start going down the list of questions. Okay. Yep, UN.
So on your that silly party,
Yes.
so the third principle of God will be your moving around that attention. Would
Yeah,
that be?
The third principle of God is really the attention focused towards the world and the person. Once the attention starts focusing back here, when the attention is turned around, it no longer is the third principle of God. It's now going back to the second principle, which remember is before, right? So it's actually only the third principle when it's pointed out. Right? Yeah. Okay, good. What other questions do we have, if any, in 4 minutes?
May I ask,
Yes.
when you started focusing very strongly on realizing that your attention was what was really the factor
Yeah.
to awakening, were there particular practices that you utilized to do that?
Yes, there have been a number of practices that I have utilized, but they really kind of fall into 2 categories. The first category is the category of letting go. Because remember, again, at first that attention is extremely attached, right? So you could call it removing attachment, but learning to notice that I'm thinking, worrying about this thing, all my attention is going there, and learning to let go of worrying about that thing. And of course, I had different things that helped me along the way. You all were just, those of you who were here when I came in the room, you were talking about what I used to let go of worry, and that's what we call trust. I used acceptance to let go of judgment. I used surrender to let go of self-will. But if you really look at every single spiritual practice, at least, and I shouldn't say that because there's another practice I'll talk about in a moment, but the vast majority of these spiritual practices, they sound like different things, right? Surrender, acceptance, trust, but they're all letting go. That's what they all are. They're letting go. And then the next practice is the turning the attention around. The turning the attention around and the focusing on pure consciousness. It's, excuse me, I'm getting a little thirsty. Let me drink for a second. That's the journey back to reabsorbing into pure consciousness. So it's detach and turn around, in short, but there's lots of different ways that we do that. Right? One of the primary purposes of meditation is the turning around, sitting down, closing your eyes and turning your attention back and noticing that you are that which is seen. Even when Buddhists are doing the practice of watching the thoughts going by, what they're really doing is noticing, I'm not the thought, I'm not that, I'm the consciousness that this thought is passing by in. So all really strong forms of meditation, and there are a few different ones, they all have one real goal. The goal of meditation is to turn the attention around to consciousness and start noticing that's what you are. So you could say awakening is a two-step process, although again, there's myriads of practices that help with these two steps. One is letting go of the world, of the person, of the thoughts, of everything in the fourth principle. Even letting go of participating in the third principle, which really is just believing everything, having attention focused on everything. And then the second step is turning that attention around and making the journey home back to what you are. And I think we're out of time. So next week, I will begin going down the list of questions. I do have them all. And if there are a couple more, feel free to send them to me. And then we'll just start working our way down the questions. All right. See y'all.